for this. And if you haven't signed up for the rest of our Policy for the People series of lunchtime webinars, please do so. Allison is going to put a link in the chat that you can click on to sign up for the whole series if you haven't already done so. So today, I'm going to start out. You can move ahead, Allie. Thank you. Today, I'm going to start off with this welcome and introduction. I will be passing it over to another staff member, Max de Faria, to do an introduction to the Rhode Island Food Policy Council Bill Tracker. And then we will go into a summary of our 2023 state legislative outcomes and our amazing panel of council members looking back and looking ahead. There will be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So please jot down any questions that come to mind during the course of the event. So I'm going to start out just by making sure that everyone on the call is aware of our mission. The Food Policy Council is building a more equitable, accessible, economically vibrant, and environmentally sustainable food system here in Rhode Island. We're an independent nonprofit network of food system stakeholders, and we work to create a more just and resilient food system together. The food system in Rhode Island is really important. Our state's food system generates around $12 billion in annual sales and employs nearly 64,000 Rhode Islanders. We have over 55,000 acres of agricultural land, and annual sales from our important seafood sector top $600 million a year. At the same time, nearly a third of our residents are food insecure, and we throw over 100,000 tons of compostable food waste into the landfill every year. So we have a lot going for us, and we also have some pretty entrenched challenges. So that's really why the Rhode Island Food Policy Council exists. We reflect on the diversity of interests and impacts that I just shared, and we focus on the entire food system. So if you look at this cycle, you can see that starts with production on our farms and fisheries, then moves into processing, distribution, retail in all of the different forms that it takes, consumption, which of course includes food access, and the management of food waste. We also think about pieces that impact all of the different parts of that food supply chain, including clean air and water, healthy soil, land access, capital access, and of course, a supportive policy environment. And we look for challenges where they exist all within this system and work to create change around those areas. I want to take a moment now to share our commitment to equity. This is a commitment that the council created and revisits every year to make sure that in everything we do, we are centering equity. The council recognizes the fact that the many negative impacts of Rhode Island going on in Rhode Island's current food system are grounded in a history of colonialism, genocide of indigenous people, slavery, private ownership of land, and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of too few. We also recognize that people with visible and non-apparent disabilities are among the most marginalized groups in our country. And we believe that when power shifts to be shared more equitably across our communities and across our state, we can transform our future together for generations to come. The way that we do that is kind of separated out into some big buckets. We have core issues of food access and nutrition, where we work to build equitable and culturally relevant solutions to food and nutrition access problems. Food business and economy, where we work to empower farmers, aquaculturists, fishers, and food entrepreneurs. Food, climate, environment, where we address pressing issues at the intersection of climate change, environment, and food systems. And food education and workforce, growing educated stakeholders, informed youth, and building a robust food sector workforce. These core issues inform the development of our annual policy priorities, which is done by our network members. We have over 125 people who contributed to the process of developing our 2023 policy priorities. So Looking at our 2023 policy priorities, you can see we have them separated into 4 different areas: preserving our farms, diverting food from landfills, ensuring food access, and supporting food business. And we work on specific policy issues and pieces of legislation over the course of the session every year. And that's what our speakers are going to be talking about more in a moment. Our workgroup activities include advocacy strategy building, holding legislative roundtables, holding one-on-one meetings with key legislators, coordinating letter campaigns, forming coalitions, testifying at hearings, and more. And I do want to note at this time that those of you who aren't already part of our membership can become members simply by joining a work group and being active in that work group and committing to be in alignment with our mission. You'll hear more about that a little later on as well. So with that, I'm going to pass things along to Max DeFaria, who is our Senior Program Associate at the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, to introduce you to one of the most powerful advocacy resources we have here at the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, our bill tracker.
Thank you, Nessa. So for folks who are interested in tracking legislation that aligns with our policy priorities or any legislation that is related to Rhode Island's food system, we encourage you to check out our bill tracker, which you can see in the photos here that Ali put together. Our bill tracker is available at the website at www.rifoodcouncil.org/bill tracker, and it's updated every week while the General Assembly is in session. We use the bill tracker to sort all introduced legislation into one of 9 topical areas. The bills are categorized into access to healthy food, agriculture, climate change, environmental protection, equity and justice, fisheries and aquaculture, food businesses, food safety, and finally, recycling, recovery, and wasted food. So each week during the session, our network volunteers and staff work together to write summaries for the bill tracker, highlighting changes and updates to legislation from week to week. Last year, our bill tracker followed over 150 pieces of legislation from start to finish throughout the session, and all of those pieces of legislation would have some impact on Rhode Island's food system. And so with that, it's now my honor to pass the conversation to RIFPC's board president, Diane Lynch, to discuss some of those key bills that our network was listening to last session. Diane?
Thanks, Max. Actually, I think at this point, we might want to turn our screen sharing off, Ali. Is that correct? Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Lynch, and I am going to be moderating a discussion today with 2 members of the council who have pretty good experience and knowledge about the legislative process here in Rhode Island. So I'm going to introduce both of them, and then we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A between all of us, and then we'll be able to open up the floor so that there's plenty of time for people who are attending to ask any questions that they have. So the first person that we're going to be hearing from is Steve Arthurs. Steve actually serves on the board of the Food Policy Council as well as I do. And Steve has 40+ years of experience in the food industry. He's worked in manufacturing and distribution, and his last gig has been as the president and CEO of the Rhode Island Food Dealers Association. And in that role, he was very active on the Hill, getting to know legislators and understanding the impacts of policy on food retailers and food dealers. So Steve is going to give us an overview of how the 2023 legislative session worked. And then later on, we'll talk about some projections for next year. And our other panelist is David Dedekian. And David has also been very active on the Food Policy Council. He's actually a former chair of the Food Policy Council. And David originated an organization called Eat, Drink, Rhode Island in 2010. And that is the state, I guess it's the state's most active PR organ for just, talking about food, marketing food, making food events, and really celebrating the local food system here. But David also has a bunch of other roles. He's very involved in small businesses, and he hosts a roundtable discussion on food small businesses and small businesses. He also occasionally works as a lobbyist, so he really does know the scene up at the State House. So those are our two panelists, and I'm going to start by letting Steve talk to us a little bit about a look back on 2023, how that session went, and sort of an overview of what happened, the major things that happened, and why. You're on mute, Steve.
There we go. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm going to give a very top line overview of the last legislative session, looking really to focus on the General Assembly, what they accomplished through either legislation or budget, and particularly trying to zero in on some areas that are of interest to members of this council. So overall, the council, by most people's assessment, was successful or productive, particularly when you measure it against what they said they were going to do and what they actually did. So at the beginning of the session and prior to the session, actually, both the Senate President and the House Speaker and other members of leadership, met with the media and discussed what they foresaw happening, or indeed what their priorities were for the next session, what they needed to get done. So Speaker Shikachi particularly talked about housing, which has always been a focus of his, voting rights, developing a Rhode Island biotech life science hub, shoreline access, and equity and abortion coverage. President of the Senate Ruggiero talked about the elimination of the Secretary of Health, Human Services position and making it a cabinet position. It's probably the only thing that really didn't get done. Replacing housing secretary and making other improvements to the housing initiatives, adjusting the education formula, how cities and towns get state funds for education, and online betting. They both made points of significance to say they needed to further develop and put teeth, so to speak, into the Climate Act. And they both mentioned business and economic development, particularly continuing the recovery impacted small businesses, in particular around COVID, and growth. How's the future? Are we going to lay the foundation for future growth? What do we need to do to take care of that? So out of those 11 areas, 10 either saw legislation or a budget that addressed those issues. So from that perspective, when people look at it, they say, well, they did what they said they're going to do, and that's good. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and talk about the biggest issues, or the four main areas. If you looked at what legislation passed, and if you looked at essentially what's in the budget, it really is into four areas. So they include housing, which I'll talk about first, business and economic development, the environment, and education. So under housing, the speaker submitted, both directly from himself and through other legislators, 14 bills on housing. They all passed out of the House, obviously, and 13 of the 14 passed out of the Senate and was either added in the budget or became law. The legislation was signed by the governor. Just a couple of the big ones. There was 39 million for housing development, 45 million in state fiscal recovery funds. They were earmarked for homelessness. There was a low-income tax credit, which I think had a ticket of $30 million. They amended zoning standards to make it easier to add dwellings. They made it easier to convert commercial structures into housing and bypass some of the pre-existing requirements. And one of the bigger things was the $251 million for the Department of Housing, and Stefan Pryor was obviously made the head of that, and he got just about everything he asked for, either through legislation or through the budget. Business economic development, among other things that happened, is the biggest one probably for most business owners was the elimination of the tangible tax. So 75% of the companies that paid that tax previously would no longer have to pay it. And of the other 25% that are still paying it, it's at a very reduced rate. There was $45 million earmarked for the life science sector. That was one of the particular initiatives by the speaker. There was $6 million to establish a new minority business accelerator and $2.2 million in direct assistance to small business development or small business initiation. On the environment side, we saw quite a bit happen, actually. But one of the bigger ones that doesn't get talked about too much because a lot of people don't really understand it, but they reformed the state net metering and renewable energy growth programs. That really leads the pathway to continued and expansion of solar development. They addressed, established the shoreline access, public areas of the shoreline, which is still a topic of conversation if you saw the news yesterday. They fully funded the Executive Climate Coordinating Council. They banned polystyrene. So that bill, which I've been quite involved with over the past several years, has actually been introduced in one form or another in 11 of the last 12 sessions. And through the involvement of the policy process, it finally did become law. Another one established a joint committee, legislative commission, to study how best to handle plastic waste, particularly plastic bottles. So that's another issue with bottle bills. They've come out, I think, 9 out of the last 10 sessions in different iterations, different formulations. No one could come to agreement on what the best options were, so they put together this commission. There was actually a commission established by the Senate 7 years ago that I was part of that looked at the same issue. So 7 years later, we still don't have a resolution, and it needs further debate. Then education, quite a bit happened. There was modified the funding formula, which was an issue that particularly Senate President wanted to take a look at. There was different budget amounts, $7 million for early childhood education and $4 million for the Governor's Learn 365 Rhode Island program. Both of those are in addition to or supplemental to what was in the previous year. And they temporarily removed restrictions on the number of days that retired teachers could work, try and address the teacher shortage issue. A couple of the things that really will help, I think, to solidify Rhode Island College, the Hope Scholarship, which provides a 3rd and 4th year free tuition for Rhode Island residents, and establish the Cybersecurity Institute at Rhode Island College as well. So that's kind of a very, very top line view of those are the big areas. Here's what was done. And then in our next section, I want to talk a little bit about some particular bills that are food related and also take a look at what could potentially come back. But I thought it was interesting to take a brief analytical viewpoint of all this. If you actually, Max talked about the bill tracker, but there were 164 bills that we were tracking that were in the 9 areas that we covered, that Max, I think, also covered. But it's interesting because of that 164, 26 of the 164 actually passed or were included in other legislation, which is 16%. So believe it or not, that's not bad, because on an average year, it's only about 18% of the bills that are actually presented that pass. That number is somewhat nebulous because there are some bills that don't pass as a bill, but they're included in the budget. So, but still, it's 16% isn't unrealistic, I should say. But what is interesting or unrealistic is that in our 9 areas, there were 3 areas that got absolutely no bills passed: access to healthy food, recycling food waste, equity and justice. And 2 of the 2 areas had a significant number of bills. So climate change had 5 bills passed and food business had 10. So it's significant because, well, a couple of reasons, but the biggest one in my mind is those are 2 areas that had the most significant number of bills, but they're also 2 areas that were part of the focus areas of the goals of the General Assembly, or particularly the leadership of the General Assembly. So one could draw a conclusion that for the other areas that got no bills, access to healthy food, didn't have any bills passed, equity and justice, and recycling and food waste. We have an obvious need to make leadership aware of the need to act on those items. So clearly, looking at the numbers, that should be our goal as we go. And it's not changed year to year, but we can kind of zero in on what those particular areas, what do we need to do? How do we get attention brought to it and so forth? So that once again, if there's questions that you have, you can either leave them to the end or write them down, or you could certainly add them into the notes on the screen there, and we'll address them when the time comes. And I'll turn it back over to Diane.
I know Diane's been having a few technical issues.
Nessa, you're on mute now.
Sorry about that. I know Diane's been having a little bit of problem with some wind out at her place with the internet. So I think what I'll go ahead and do is thank you for putting your questions in the chat. And I'm going to pass it over to David to do a little bit deeper dive in our food systems work that we were doing on particular legislation. Thank you so much, Steve, and I will pass it over to David now.
Thank you, Nessa. It's always a little hard to follow Steve because he's so thorough. It also makes my task always a little easier because I don't have to talk as much. But I want to focus on a few things that were very specific to the Food Policy Council and what we tried to do this year. The interesting thing, to give it a big broad perspective, like Steve said, so many bills get submitted. Things take a lot of time over the years. Like you mentioned, the styrofoam and the bottle bill take a lot of time. But sometimes things have to go pretty quickly, and you don't expect them, and you have to work on them pretty quickly. And that's one of the things that really we mobilized behind this year and made sure it happened, which was farmland preservation. It had been in the budget previously, in the governor's budget previously, and for a reason that we're still not quite clear on, it was removed from the governor's budget this year. So when the budget came out in January, that money that has been set aside for DEM for years to buy farmland and be able to sell it back to farmers at a reduced rate, not at the real estate rate, the commercial and residential real estate rate, was removed. And so the Food Policy Council immediately mobilized a bunch of us. Well, first of all, we were upset and outraged, so we had that moment, and then a bunch of us started contacting our legislators, contacting the governor's office, trying to figure out how we could get this back into the budget. It went through a lot of different emails, a lot of different conversations, and eventually we were able to see that return to the budget through both the Senate and the House, through Senator DePalma on the Senate side and Representative McGaugh on the House side. To see 2.5 million put back into the budget to be able to restore those funds to DEM to be able to preserve farmland. So things like that are immediate, and something that the Food Policy Council was very good at being active and jumping on it and making sure that we were able to restore that. Other things take time. Other things go on through the years. We've all been very active with promoting and updating LASA over the years, and thankfully over the last couple of years we've been able to get that to $700,000 in the governor's budget for the LASA program. For those of you who don't know, that's the Local Agriculture and Seafood Act, small grant, $20,000 grant program for farmers and aquacultures. And so that thankfully has been kept at the $700,000 amount. And just personally, as a member of the LASA committee, and Nessa as well as on the committee, and I don't see the entire list in front of me, but I'm sure someone else here may be on the committee as well. We know how difficult it is to allocate that money to all the many grant applications that come in every year. So it's great to see that we always get more grant applications than there is money. And even at the $700,000 cap, we got more grant applications than there was money. So it's nice to see things like that happen. Interestingly, we did see a lot of bills come back this year. The House actually now has a rule where you could just automatically bring a bill back the next session if it doesn't get through the first time. That didn't really seem to make much impact, but we'll keep an eye on that. The thing to remember and understand is if a bill does go through the session and does not get passed, it has to be reintroduced the next time. And so these are types of things that you as a constituent should remember to speak to your representative senator and say, hey, this was something I support, this is something I believe in. please bring it back next year. The other thing that I always try to remind people when talking about policy is remember that our General Assembly, it's a part-time General Assembly. They are mostly made up of, in a lot of cases, small business lawyers and accountants, but sometimes retired folks. They're not necessarily aware of all the issues that we want them to be aware of. Certainly not experts on the issues like those of us here on this meeting in the realm of food policy. And so a lot of times what we need to do is educate and make them understand, help them understand. I want to say make them, help them understand why it is that some things are important. I mean, some things that seem like, complete no-brainers to us, like, of course, saving farmland, thankfully was not a hard sell to our representatives and senators, but it's still something that we have to try and craft the language behind and explain, our cause and get them to understand, because then they have to go out and essentially sell it to their fellow members, first on their committees and then to the larger General Assembly in some cases. There were some things that, I would say are disappointments, but things that just, we need to really try and focus on to help them understand a little better. We were assisted in the sense of that we had some ARPA funds this year that was able to be set aside for the food bank, but that's $3 million that, the food bank will not get next year. So something, to keep in mind when it comes to food access. There's been a lot of attempted reform at CRMC, which takes a long time. That affects aquaculturists. These are things that I think are very direct to our food system. And obviously I'm a little more focused on small businesses and farms, which is kind of redundant because I don't think there are any farms in our state that wouldn't be considered a small business. But I think we always have to drive that point home to help our General Assembly understand what it is that they're doing. And thankfully, we do have some good members in the General Assembly who, like I said, are small business owners themselves, so they do get it. The tangible taxes Steve mentioned was a great benefit. Interestingly, from a perspective of a lot of the restaurants I work with, the tangible tax was reduced to a $50,000 cap. A lot of the restaurants I work with have more than $50,000, so they're still paying that tangible tax. Things like the bottle bill that go through a lot of different iterations can certainly affect. I work with Yakliff Soda and Granny Squibb. So, we all have these different things and we all have to try and make these compromises, and we all have to understand that nothing in legislature is perfect for anyone. But we certainly are trying to move it forward in a positive direction, and teaching the General Assembly why is really the key goal, I think, in a lot of these cases. So unless you want to talk about any specific bills, Diane, while you're out, I did mention the Farmland Conservation, which Diane was very key on as well. So I think, if you wanted to add anything there, you certainly could, Diane, but I think I gave a good dive into some of the things that we worked on this year that were specific. There are other things like a tax credit for food donations, many things, unfortunately, in the food waste and feeding the insecure that did not move forward, that we're going to have to keep pushing on and keep driving forward. So here's to the next session, which for those of you who don't know, again, I mentioned it's part-time General Assembly. The session essentially runs January to June, 4 nights a week, occasionally more, depending on the leadership.
Thank you, David. Sorry I dropped off. I actually live in the wilds of South County, and there's a bit of wind down here, and I think it just knocked out all of the internet on my block. I don't know. It's pretty crazy, but I'm on my phone, which is not perfect, but I will continue to participate as best as I can. Sorry I had to miss your comments. One of the things that I thought would be really interesting would be to ask both Steve and David separately to do a little forward projection and talk a little bit about what the major changes are that they expect to affect what happens in 2024. And again, not trying to put you guys on the spot in terms of projections, but you are more in touch with how the legislature might be changing and what's happening on the budget in terms of revenues at the state level, federal support, things like that. And how different coalitions that advocate for different policies may be evolving. So let's start with Steve. Any thoughts about how 2024 might look?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that everyone needs to be aware of that, we're in year 2 of the 2-year cycle of General Assembly members, so it's an election year. It also means that new legislators have been there the first year, now they're in the second year. So traditionally in the second year of the term, you don't see a lot of changes. People, you see a few we'll probably see a couple of committee chairs change for different reasons, but not a lot of that is, as far as membership goes, is going to change. What is going to change is it's an election year. They're much more driven to get things done early, get out and campaign. They need to show results, so to speak, particularly if you're a newer member, you need to go back out and tell your constituents that, I supported this, I introduced that, I did this. So if you were new and couldn't get your legislation through or submitted last year, you'll make an effort to do that this year. But I personally think the most overriding piece this year will be the revenue. The revenue projections are significantly less than what they've been the last 2 years. So, and as David mentioned, the ARPA funding of the federal funds in general, the supplemental federal funds aren't going to be there. So particularly, well, with both the Senate and the House, but I know Speaker Sakachi has spoken at length about, we need to be very careful now, even at the end of last session, because he saw this coming. So where they've added new programs over the last 2 sessions, that's going to be much more difficult to do so. So when you introduce legislation that's going to require spending this session, you're going to have a little bit tougher time. You'll have to present a much more developed argument as to why. So just quickly looking at some of the open issues from bills that we've been following or been a part of that haven't moved forward. Something like healthy meals for school children, which I'm sure it's going to be introduced again. That actually passed the Senate, didn't pass the House, but it was sent over late and they really didn't even deal with it. The House had slightly different versions, so they weren't companion bills. There was some other issues there. I think it will come back, but that would be one that has the biggest hurdle is going to be money, revenue.
Yeah.
How are we going to pay for it? Some other ones that, like taxable incentives for food donations. McEntee's bill on House, I'm sure is going to come back. It's still going to cost money because if you can either spend money or you can not get revenue in. So that would take revenue out. But I think you'll see that come back as well. Some of the other things that in the areas where we really saw no action don't really cost a lot of money. So expanding organic waste ban to 30 miles, you're not going to cost you any money for that. The sliding scale for benefits, we talked about as income rises, which most people thought was a no-brainer, really didn't pass through, won't cost any money. So it's going to be interesting, but I mean, that's what I see as happening. I think the focus would be, or your chances of moving legislation forward would be those that are revenue neutral. They're not going to cost the money, not going to cost a lot to spend, and it's not going to cost revenue coming into the state.
Yeah.
So for go ahead, David, go ahead.
I was just say that would be my agreement. It's going to come down to money this next year, especially on the House side. The Speaker is fiscally conservative is probably too easy a term. He's very frugal. He's as a person, he's very frugal. So I think it bleeds into everything that he does and looks at. I'll tell a brief little anecdote. I'm on the board of directors of EcoRI News. Last September, we had our annual fundraiser. He was a guest of one of our sponsors, came to the table, didn't know he was a guest, so he handed over $100 to buy a ticket. The sponsor came up and said, "Oh no, Speaker, you're my guest this evening." He took his $100 back, which we're still laughing about to this day every time we have a board meeting. he's just, I think, some people are, brought up, with that mindset, very frugal, very money conscious. And I think that bleeds over very much into his running the house, which in many ways is a good thing. I'm not saying it's always a bad thing. But I think, it's going to come down to money for a lot of these things. School meals, as many of you may know, just passed in Massachusetts. I want to see it passed here. Obviously, I think we all do, but I have a hard time seeing how that's going to exactly happen with the amount of money that it will cost. Like Steve said, it's an election year. Though at the moment, I don't see a lot of change. I don't see a lot of people that seem, in a precarious position. Though that said, the beauty of Rhode Island is anything can happen at any time, or nothing can happen. That's the way we are here. So, for example, who knew David Cicilline was going to, retire? If the speaker decided he was going to run for CD1, then, we'd obviously be looking at a new speaker in the House. And those things do happen. We don't know, come next year, who's going to retire and things like that, and who might change seats. And that always affects the committees and things of that nature. So I think that's something to keep an eye on as the session goes on next year. Like Steve said, they try to tighten it up so that they can get out early and start campaigning, but it's generally like maybe a week tighter. It's not usually that much shorter. They can't seem to get out of their own ways in terms of scheduling sometimes. And then on the Senate side, I do think Ruggiero is a little less frugal, but he does tend to focus on things that really are important to him. Whereas I feel that the House tends to be a little more egalitarian in some ways. So I think that, that's something to keep an eye on for 2024.
Interesting. So, one of the big things in 2023 was housing, right? We all saw it coming, and then it dominated the legislation, and it dominated the budget. Are there any items that are like that you see on the horizon? They may not be food related, but just from what you're hearing, they're just going to be top of mind when we hit 2024.
I mean, and again, I tend to speak to more reps and senators that are more in agreement with myself. Than I think that's just the nature of the beast right now. Is I don't speak to Representative Chippendale as much as I probably should, but there seems to be a big concern around climate. Now, the other part of that is what more can be done on the state level. But that does seem to be a hot topic of conversation. I don't need to be a pun there, but climate seems to be something a lot of people want to discuss and want to try to understand, and that includes offshore wind and solar and renewable energy. When I say climate, I mean climate obviously touches a million things, but I think that's where I've seen some conversations and trying to understand what can be better there. I mean the housing, a lot of, like Steve said, everything the speaker brought up for housing passed. But it's still a very big problem. So I don't know that that's not going to still be a topic of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
No, I agree. I think housing is still going to be part of it. I think they'll reintroduce that one bill that didn't pass because it was basically producing requirements to let you put an in-law apartment in your home is really what it comes down to.
Right.
And there was some misunderstanding, I think, on the Senate side of what that was, or they were afraid of what the outcome would be, and that you'd have, would open up the doors for having 2 or 3 families living in a one-family home or whatever. But I do think that that's going to be reintroduced, and they could possibly look at. They passed a lot of legislation. A lot of it was geared around either reducing regulations or providing other stimulus, not necessarily just money. So I think you'll see other bills like that. It's really not a lot of spending. It's more regulatory. How can we put something out there to make it easier for people to increase the amount of housing? Because a lot's been spent over the last 2 years on it. But I know, particularly on the speaker, I'm sure that there's more that's going to be introduced there. A couple of the areas that aren't related to food that I think will be back based on comments that both Speaker Circacci and Senate President Ruggiero mentioned at session end is they really didn't deal with the reform of the law office's Bill of Rights, which is a very sensitive topic, particularly on the Senate side, but on both sides. I do think they're going to do something. The Senate passed legislation. It got to the House like at the last week of submission, so they didn't even take it up. They had no debate on it. And then the Senate president admitted that, they did it too late. The timing was off. So I think that's one you'll see come back. It really doesn't cost any money, and in many people's opinions, it needs a revision. So the one that will cost money that came up, it's on the House side in particular. When the budget was actually passed, 2 or 3 reps stood up and they didn't really try to submit a floor amendment, but they brought up the issue that, the state's pension plan, the viable lifetime, the disability pension, all of that, they need to do something with that. And the speaker did go on record to say, yes, we didn't pass it this year. We're going to take a more stricter look at it next year. And but that costs money. So what they're going to do, I don't know. But if he said he's going to bring it up, I think he's going to bring it up. The other one was gun control. There's still a number of members, not among Senate leadership, that really want to see more stricter gun regulations. So once again, that doesn't cost any money. It's highly volatile, not just for people with guns, but in general, those hearings are very different and take up a lot of time. But I think you'll see those come back. And what they do is particularly if they don't have funds or a dollar tag tied to them, they take away from your opportunity to maybe get some other things done or submit other legislation. So you kind of have to keep an eye on how that pans out, where you find your spot to have the opportunity to move one of your own initiatives forward.
Yeah. They take up a lot of airspace, and then they take up a lot of budget. Some of the bills that you guys were talking about that don't require funding, like for instance, the organic waste ban, the tax incentives for food donations, which cost a little bit, but not a whole hell of a lot. Are those, which of those stand a chance? And are the issues with those, the reasons that they stalled out, for instance, because there wasn't enough coalition building behind them, or are there other political reasons why some of those are stalled?
Go ahead, David.
My initial feeling in talking to people is lack of education in some cases. I don't think the members behind it really understood why those things were as important as they should have been, or they didn't think it was going to make that big of a difference, so they didn't focus on it. I mean, like Steve said, 16 to 18%, of the bills get passed, which there's a lot of bills. I mean, that's the reality. So some things just don't get the bandwidth that they require. And I think sometimes even with something like those 2 bills you just mentioned, Diane, it just needs more education of the members and make sure they understand, hey, this is an easy thing to do because it's not going to cost any money. And this is why it's really important to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think with regards to the raising the mileage to 30 miles for organic waste and using incubators and so forth, I think that to David's point, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what that actually is or why it's important. But I was quite involved with that. There's also, and there was a House commission put together that we looked into that, and the results that came out of that were just very general and nothing actually has happened. But I really think that, they're overstated. You kind of have to look at it in 2 places. You want to reduce food waste, you don't want to go to landfill. And some legislators key on that. And then this is the right thing to do. There's reusable food that we can get to an alternate source. To me, they're 2 separate issues. And sometimes they combine that into one bill. It becomes too confusing. Once again, to a point that David made earlier, this is a part-time legislator. You need to help them out. They don't tend to be experts on it. When a bill's confusing or all-encompassing, particularly the organic one, there's a bill in place now that if you're within whatever it is, 15 miles, I think it is.
15, right.
And then I think the other question of it in the last session was the number of pounds, because you're exempt if you're under a certain weight. And I know a lot of restaurants, they had a concern of, they're not philosophically opposed to it, but like, how am I going to get that there to these, it's 22 miles away. That's not the easiest thing. And, food's perishable and so forth. So I think there is clarity within the bill, I think, that needs to happen as well. And the last point on that, from a supermarket's perspective, all of the chains have a very sophisticated program and would be exempt from that anyway. Stop and Shop has their own anaerobic digester, so it all goes out of state. Shaw's, it's all shipped out of state. I'm trying to think of ShopRite, well, just Price Right in Rhode Island. Most of that goes actually back to New Jersey, or they have very sophisticated programs set up where a large part of it is donated, and even the large independents, they already have a plan in place. So I think it really needs, if you want to get some more support, you got to go after restaurant groups to make them better understand how it could work, and then get the legislators involved as well. But to your point, it doesn't involve any money, so it would seem like there's an opportunity there. It's been submitted. Well, the first one passed, I think, 4 years ago, and it's been introduced every year since to either expand the tonnage or reduce this tonnage so more people are applying to it, or put the mileage in. The biggest thing with the miles was there was only two sources in Rhode Island.
Right.
So, it was kind of unrealistic of how you approach it, but that's my thoughts on it anyway.
Interesting, David, probably the same. So it's a combination of education, understanding, and maybe clarifying the bills so that they're easier for people to get behind. I have one more question, and then I'm happy to open it up, although I'm going to have to ask someone else on the staff to identify where this question is coming from, because I can't see on my phone. But my last question is about the governor. So we haven't talked about the governor's office and the governor's staff and what kind of impact that could have. I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Steve, you want to go first?
You can go first.
Steve's smiling.
Okay, fine. Well, we're both smiling because, honestly, it hasn't been the easiest administration to work with. They're not bad. There's not a lot of experience sometimes. And it shifts around a lot. And as we've seen even recently, a lot of the more experienced folks leave to go private sector. So it requires a lot of education and finesse in many cases. But there are wins. I will say, for example, with LASA, like I mentioned, a bunch of us were going at it different ways over the years. And one of the ways that I think finally got through to the governor's office last year was by stressing the importance of small business, because he's really a small business focused governor. And so I think that's how that was one of the many things that got LASA added, increased in the budget. The budget is extremely important. The governor's, we just had a conversation last week with his office about the upcoming budget. He seems very small business focused this year. Again, that's kind of his pet thing, and so that we use that to our advantage. But it's not always the easiest to try and get them to understand what it is we're trying to do.
No, I think you hit it right on the head. In talking to others who do similar jobs, or did similar jobs in my case, that we do, they almost avoid, there are certain issues, for example, not to name names, but when Governor Raimondo was governor, on certain issues, you went through the State House and they helped influence the General Assembly. That's not the way it seems to work now, and more people, more lobbyists, professional lobbyists, are working to go through leadership in the General Assembly, and they'll work with the governor's office, so to speak. Or if you went through a department, to try and get something done, and then they put it forth, it just seems in a lot of instances it doesn't move. So that's frustrating, of course, to many, but certainly anything involving small business, you can almost have a direct line to the governor. That's his thing. It's always been his thing. he spent almost his entire time as lieutenant governor dealing with that, and it's near and dear to him. But anything else, there seems to be, I don't know if it's confusion, but it doesn't move forward. It's not results oriented, I guess you'd call it. So it's something that, needs to be recognized. And if you're in your plan of action, so to speak, when you build a coalition, you really got to focus, I think, on General Assembly or on certain bills and, put your resources towards that.
Yeah. I mean, to use the farmland conservation that we did this previous session as an example, I don't think any of us got any response from the governor's office on that at all, right? It was all Senator Palmer and Rep. McGaugh. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's very true. So I guess, in my limited experience, which is really pretty limited, if it isn't presented as something that has to do with small business, and many food businesses are small businesses, so that it doesn't include many of the food business issues, it doesn't get much of a response. And I guess that's not likely to change in the next few years. Whereas you think about when Governor Raimondo was here, that was the genesis of the development of the Director of Food Strategy, was out of her office. Right. And not really the legislature. So the pendulum swings, right, with different individuals. But I like the fact that we're talking a lot about education and advocacy, because that's so much what our Food Policy Council members are interested in, and there's definitely a need for it. So I can see roughly that there are questions coming up, or at least one question coming up, but I'm not going to try to moderate. I'm going to get back to Nessa. Yeah.
I can read it out from Noreen Drexel has shared the question. How would you lay out a strategy, and what advice would you have for the healthy school meals for all legislation?
Good question.
I mean, I hate to say it comes down to figuring out how to pay for it, but in that case, I just feel that this year coming, that's really going to be the big question: is how do you pay for it? Because
what was the price tag on that? Wasn't there an estimate last year?
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't have that up. I don't remember what it was.
I was just curious.
Because unfortunately there was a lot of different tiers to it. There was some bill submitted to use some of the ARPA funds, which obviously would only be temporary. There was a bill submitted to only allow a certain I don't even know how they describe it, certain level of income for the child to get food. There was a bill submitted to have lunch and breakfast available to everyone, right. Which is what Massachusetts did. But I mean, it's kind of, I hate to say you don't need to focus on the fact that we're feeding children, because obviously that's an easy thing for people to understand, but you do have to point that out. You do, even if you think you don't need to point that out, you do need to point out, hey, children need to be fed to have a better education, to have a better life and all that, which seems like a no-brainer, but it does need to be stressed. But of that, and then the budgetary thing, I think it needs to be somehow figured out how to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those bills that I don't think anyone, because it's never came up to a floor vote.
Right, that's it. I would be very interested if it came up to a floor vote and someone said, I don't want to feed the children. Like that would, obviously that person would not do that, but who knows?
It would seem that if they could come up, it's going to be reintroduced, but rather than have 7 or 8 bills with 7 or 8 variations, if you could get together with a companion bill that is more narrowly focused, perhaps, maybe don't do breakfast and lunch and start with, I don't know what that difference in dollars would be, but because it's just going to come down to dollars and cents. And in this instance, I think if you're going to put a program like that, because I want to say the tag was 15-18 million, was that a number on one of them?
Yeah, it was
right. Yeah, maybe.
I think so.
It's going to come out of someplace else. So where
I just want to point out a sort of a recent history learning, which is that the environmental advocacy community, which represents many different perspectives, when they finally pulled together, and it was very intentional and it was very difficult in 2020, and they all got behind the Act on Climate bill for 2021, it passed. Yeah. But it took a lot of intentional activity for people to bury their differences, because that's everyone does have subtle differences, and sometimes sticking to those can be detrimental. So just that could be something that the Healthy School Meals for All considers as a strategy to try to, instead of having multiple bills, to try to get everybody behind one, if that's possible.
Absolutely.
Diane, I wanted to see if Noreen had something she wanted to share. I think maybe Noreen, you came off mute for a minute.
I don't know if I did or not, but I was just saying, I'm gonna answer the question in the moment that I had heard the figure of 30 million.
I'm sure it can be that high. I mean, it really, I think, depends on what the definition of breakfast, lunch, prepared. There's all sorts of different levels to it. I mean, to Diane's point about there being one bill, part of that is I hate to be kind of obnoxious about it, but egos. Different representatives wanted to be the one that put this through, and so I think you need to work with that sometimes and say, hey, look, this may not be your bill, but it's their bill, but get your name on it and we'll invite you to the signing and all that ridiculousness.
Max has their hand raised.
Thanks, Nessa. Yeah, I just want to mention, since Noreen brought it up, I also vaguely recall that specifically for Representative Caldwell's bill, which was Healthy School Meals for All, that piece of legislation was being estimated between 32 million, I believe, is what was the hearing. So some background there.
Margaret, you got your hand up? Mute, Margaret.
Sorry, I just have a quick, want to get folks' reaction to, the bill that we're trying to build a coalition for is one that would lower thresholds for existing farm tax exemption so that small scale and urban farmers can benefit from the same tax exemptions that larger farmers can benefit from.
Right.
And just sort of as an aside, some of the strategies are actually not just lowering that, but like creating a different category of exemption, creating a different program that works better for urban and small scale farmers to achieve the same end, not just change the program to lower the threshold, but actually create a new program in certain circumstances so that these small and urban farmers can have a similar benefit on their farm business. Sorry to have gone off on what was a little bit too much in the weeds, but I don't want to be misrepresenting what we're asking for. So this is the legislation, but wait a second. Yep. I've started calling it the farm tax equity legislation. And I don't know if that's the right thing to call it. I don't know if that's like a good move or if it's too edgy or if somebody's going to get angry about it, or so I just wanted to hear like people's response to that messaging. Is farm tax equity a good name for it? I don't know.
That's a great question.
That's always, you're always going to upset someone. I mean, that's the reality of it. We don't know. I think what I just wanted to say, I apologize for interrupting. What I just wanted to get in was sometimes it is a good idea, and again, it's sometimes to latch onto something that already exists and works, like the tax for larger farms, and just say, look, this already works. Why can't we just extend it? Essentially, that's kind of what we did with cottage food. Was this already works for farm-based cottage food? Why not just extend it? And that didn't work out perfectly, but it was at least a doorway. So I would recommend sometimes keeping that in mind. I don't know, Steve, what do you think of that?
Well, first off, normally putting tax in the title of anything isn't a good idea.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think that. You're right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think David, I mean, that's a good point too. I was just thinking of, and I can't off the top of my head, but it would seem that if this, I know you're gearing it towards the small farms, but if we could build a coalition with some of the other existing groups that are looking for tax relief for small business development, and when at it through that angle, you'd have more support. And that's one you could go through the governor's office to try and either get something in the budget or at least help influence it, because
Yeah.
you need a bigger piece there, particularly when you're asking for a concession. But if they look at something, if a typical legislator looks at something and says, well, this is due to farms, I don't have any farms in my area, I can't do with that. If you can put it in with another group that says, we're looking to build, they're always looking to improve for business growth, I guess is the best way to put it. So if you
Yeah.
could, and there's bills always submitted. So I think if you can get into a coalition that is more inclusive to say, we're looking for these tax relief concessions from these industries because, and then here's the outcome. Ultimately, the outcome needs to be, we need to raise, you're giving a concession here, but you're going to make it on this other end because it'll help them, whatever, expand productivity, provide jobs. Jobs is always a big one. If you could do something like that, I think, particularly next session, it might be a good approach.
Thank you.
Interesting. Small farm something. Leave the word tax out.
Yeah, I would.
Small
Yeah.
farm business.
Yeah. And yeah, and I guess it's how can you broaden that to get the maximum amount of support for it?
You want to be like a positive, so even instead of using tax, use growth or something that you just want a different word there.
And I think that also lends to, increasing the scope of the potential coalition members who are being invited to, the small business groups. That's definitely a part of what we've heard from folks who support us in advocacy around, trying to think about strange bedfellows in a sense. Who else could be part of this coalition that could strengthen it? I'm not trying to cut off conversation on that, but I do also want to note, Diane, that Dr. Ritchie has her hand raised.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. I am back online, but I still can't see everybody. Dr. Danny, where are you?
I'm here.
Okay.
So I'm kind of going to go back to, because we were talking about healthy meals for all, and then we jumped to, they're both really important. And the issue around concessions or, changing the bill, it just always makes me nervous because there's a whole equity piece in this. And when we're talking about meals, being really careful that we don't get swooped up into like that meals, just meals sounds great for everybody, and not talking about the value of nutritious food for all that gets lost in our current food systems for public institutions. So that's a lot of what we were talking about. And I don't want to keep going on about it, but I just want to make sure that we don't lose that equity piece that's really important in looking how food is distributed and to who and what quality it's distributed to people and institutions.
Great
Thank
point.
you for that. I think sometimes, within our group here on the council, I know what happens to me. I know it's an equity piece, so I don't bring it up. But I think you're right. I think it does need to be pointed out more because it's almost entirely an equity piece. I mean, really. And to me, it's just like, oh yeah, of course it is. But when you're talking to that General Assembly member, you're right. That's something that really needs to be stressed.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny. Okay, I'm gonna just take another minute, and anybody else have any burning questions or even not burning questions about what's coming up, an area that you're working in? We have Steve and David available, and they're available all the time, actually, I should say, for burning questions. If not, we can wrap up. Let's give it another minute.
Diane, while people are thinking about whether or not they have a last question, I just also wanted to add that we've got some familiar names and some unfamiliar names today on the Policy for the People series. And this is just our first one, so register for all of them if you haven't done so already. And if you want to get more engaged, and you're not engaged already along some of these issues, then please reach out to Allison to understand which work group you might want to be part of, because work groups at the Food Policy Council are open to anyone who is willing to work toward our mission. And we want to make that clear to everyone who's just, maybe this is your first contact with the Food Policy Council today. And I do see another hand raised, Dana.
Hi, this was so helpful, and I'm sorry that I had to come in late. I had some calls. I really didn't want to miss it. I really appreciate Steve and David, your answers to Diane's question about the A, about the waste ban, and B, about the tax credits. And I kind of have a question for each of you. So Steve, one of the things that you mentioned, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that one of the bottlenecks as to why that didn't get passed is because there's not enough, there was only 2 sources in Rhode Island, for composting. Was I understanding that correctly as one of the
Yes.
bottlenecks? Okay. So one thing that I've thought about and I've talked about a little bit is and it's a question that I have, is what are your thoughts on including, and specifically including food donation, redistribution for donation in the bill itself? And the reason why I'm putting that out there is because organizations like RLC, Means, and other organizations in Rhode Island, we're literally everywhere. So there is no the mileage aspect is not an issue, because we have people everywhere throughout the state who are able to do it, and it eliminates that barrier of not enough sources. It also prioritizes food donation. And if I understand the bill correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand it correctly, right now, I think it's just worded as recycling. It doesn't say redistribution. So I wonder if maybe the wording needs to be changed in order to get that message across, and that by doing so, it might promote the bill for tax credits. So I wanted to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. It goes back to, I was trying to explain, I probably didn't do a good job, but to me, you got different issues and different perspectives on it. Because one is, I think our preference among everyone is, if you have food that you can't consume and it's edible and valuable, your first option is to donate it to someone that can use it. And the second option is to, recycle or,
Animal feed.
Yeah. Or
composting, anaerobic digestion.
I mean, they're all better options than throwing it in the landfill. So we all agree with that. But, landfill is one issue. And then to me, redistribution is another one. But to answer your question directly, yes, I think if you have an infrastructure, because there was pushback among restaurants. So if you had an infrastructure that provided that, well, we can pick it up and deliver it here or whatever. Or it had provisions. There are organizations out there, and I can't think of one of them now. There's 2 or 3 of them, and they've grown, that will actually, for a fee, pick it up and bring it to a food pantry or whatever. So even if there was an incentive, which once again, for this session, I don't know that they want to spend money on it, but if there was some tax credit or some other incentive to say, if you incur cost in doing this, there'll be some kind of offset. That anything like that helps build the majority that's in favor of it. The more people you get pushing it, obviously, and the more people that understand it, the better off you are. It increases the chances that it's going to move forward. And as I said, I'm sure it's going to be reintroduced. But it's like getting to the sponsors who introduced it last year to get, if I remember right, I don't have the bills in front of me, You need a bit more co-sponsor by leadership that will help elevate the whole issue. And whatever funds are, this doesn't involve spending, but it could involve, if you do incentives, a little bit of loss, but it's small numbers, in my opinion. But it would be, the more you can combine into one pill that attempts to solve the issue, to say, I guess there's two schools of thought. One says the more complicated the bill, less likely the legislator is to read it. And that does have some truth to it. And the other one is, they don't want to piecemeal it. You want to look at solving the problem. So in the bill, you define on the top few paragraphs, here's the problem. Then you have the resolution, and you could in fact try and combine them. The other thing that we've seen happen more often the last couple of sessions is the same sponsor will submit two different bills. One of it's more extensive than the other one, but they're almost like safeguarding it to say, well, if there's elements of this bill they're going to turn off a number of people, then at least we have Plan B here. So that's another option, because that was unheard of a few years ago from the same sponsor. And even if you had two different sponsors, when it went to committee, they'd pick one, but that's not the case anymore. So that's another new option that might be viable in this case. It's another one, like the school meals. It's like, I don't think anyone's going to say that we shouldn't put waste in landfill, and we need to reallocate it to either hopefully be a resource to be food for those that need it. And then as a last resort, you want to recycle it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I would love to see the language changed in that bill, to illustrate, the priorities of use. I mean, the bottom line is we want to divert it from the landfill. And technically the highest tier is just elimination of, waste from the production side. And obviously, that bill won't address that, but if it can at least address the other tiers of the hierarchy, be it, food donation to people or animal feed, et cetera, then to me, that's a total win. And I feel like when you said that there was only two resources, I'm like, if that's a bottleneck, meanwhile, there are so many ways of diverting that food from landfills. It's almost like the bill is almost created to be too narrow to work as a solution. So it kind of, I don't want to say it makes sense that it didn't pass, but I feel like we can't give them any excuses to not pass it. So
just to clarify what I said, though, when they originally introduced the bill, there was one on board, and then there was one that was going to become available. I believe there are, and that was 3 years ago. So I believe there is a third anaerobic digester that is in use, which is more centrally located.
It doesn't have very big capacity, though.
No.
Right, exactly. And then my other question, which is I think more for David, and this is if we have time, I can always ask this question offline. I don't know what the official schedule is. So just cut me off if needed. But are there any advantages or disadvantages, or what are the advantages or disadvantages of the policy of the tax credit itself being a line item in the governor's budget versus as a standalone bill? Like, are there differences? And if there are, what are the advantages and disadvantages? And if that's a question better answered offline, I understand. I kind of just for myself needed to understand that a little bit better.
There's no difference if it passes. It affects things the same regardless of whether it's in the budget or if it's standalone. It again comes down to support. If you have the governor's support for it and the General Assembly likes that it's in there, then that's great. I don't know, Steve, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, to me, it's if you have legislation submitted and it's in the budget, you've got,
If it's both,
in the race, so to speak. So, but whether it's one or the other, because you see bills that are introduced that end up being in the budget, or you see items in the budget that are pulled out and are handled as legislation. The bottom line is you just want to move forward, so it doesn't matter. But the more coalition, the more support you have. So if you could get the governor to put in the budget, and you have sponsors that are submitting legislation, and what they put in is somewhat comparable, that's kind of the best case opportunity.
I mean, and yeah, I think the comparable part is important because you don't want to muddy it.
I'll just add to that though, Dana, that if it's not in the governor's budget, that doesn't mean that you don't have a good shot at it. It just
Right.
means you have to really
Absolutely
work
true.
with the legislative end, because that's really what happened with the farmland conservation money. It wasn't in the original budget, but it eventually there was enough pull in the legislature that it passed.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it's basically like, for lack of a better phrase, power in numbers. Right? Like, is that a
Yeah.
good way of, like,
Yeah.
if it's in both, it's power in numbers versus just having it in one? Is that a fair
It's multiple sources of support, which is great.
leverage?
Yeah,
Okay,
there's
multiple sources.
agreement that it's
Yeah.
supportive, but don't get discouraged if it's not in the governor's budget.
Right.
I would not read it that way. I would just read it that that's not the avenue where you're going to get your initial support. You're going to have to go through sponsors in the legislators.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I have a billion more questions, but those are all offline.
Wow, they were all good questions. Thank you. All righty. I don't see any other hands. Nessa, if you don't see any other hands, thank you everybody for listening in. Thank you for some really good questions. Stephen and David, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. It was really helpful. All right.
Welcome. Thank you.
We'll
Thank
see
you.
Thank you.